Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net. So I'm just giving you guys a short video right now. Right now my other video is rendering. It's going to be on shadow work. I meant to have it up on Saturday, but since I didn't get it up on Saturday, here's my last minute Saturday video. And I figure I would do a video that kind of dovetails off with the topic of my other video. So since I'm talking about shadow work in that video, this one is going to be about the collective shadow. So if you're not familiar with what the shadow is, I also have another video on my channel about that. But just a real quick recap is basically when you have an ego, you have a certain type of identification. And then anything that falls outside of that identification that you have, that gets relegated to the shadow. So let's say that you identify yourself as a righteous person and you have a certain idea of what that means, then anything that you consider to be wrong or not righteous would get relegated to the shadow. So even if it comes up in you, there's a tendency there to deny. All right, so when it comes to the collective shadow, which is the shadow of society and of the world, basically it works very, very similar to the way the individual human shadow works. And this is because a society doesn't exist outside of the individuals that actually comprise it. Like it would be a mistake to think that somehow the forest exists separate from the trees. And so society in the world sort of acts like a macrocosm of the human psyche. And in this way, we can observe social patterns. That way we can kind of see maybe some tendencies in ourselves that gets reflected out into the everyday world, or vice versa. We can see a tendency in the everyday world, and we can start to apply that to our own lives. All right, so let me kind of look at my cheat sheet here. All right, so what did I want to talk about? All right. So basically, because society has a shadow, it has a resistance to particular things. So you might notice that we, as a society, might have a tendency to have taboos against particular things. That would be what's in the social shadow. And so you might also notice that when it comes to the internet, which is a completely new mode of human interaction, this sort of acts like a mirror to the shadow. It's why oftentimes if you go into the comments section, it can be quite disturbing because you can see things there that you didn't quite expect. And what you'll notice is that there are a lot of people that feel deep frustration and a lot of anger. All right. So basically, it makes me pretty uncomfortable to see all of the people who just seem so very unhappy from just the way they put themselves across. But in a sense, you can use this to sort of notice these social patterns and to become more aware of the shadow traits within yourself. Let's take a look here. Sorry about the pauses, kind of doing this last minute. Uh, Okay, so the trick in being able to use this to your own benefit, to see your own shadow and to reintegrate your own shadow, or to actually affect things out here, is basically to not make value judgments and not demonize anyone for the way that they are. What you have to understand is that human beings, the way that they are, is influenced by so many different factors, and you could just as easily have been subject to those same factors, factors of genetics and of exposure to different elements within life. And really, our birth is ourselves, and the fact that our awareness resides with this one person is actually quite arbitrary if you think about it. You could just as easily have been born as anybody else. You know, your awareness could reside as a completely different person. And so, in a sense, you have to be able to see that everybody is kind of at the mercy of the circumstances of their birth. And so in that way, you can look and not demonize things, but just to see people as neutral occurrences within the world. And that's when you can start to glean some wisdom off of the way people are and the way that people act. Well, Also, you have to realize too that human beings are mostly similar. We work in very, very similar ways. So even if there's somebody who is exhibiting some abnormal traits, even they have mostly the same traits as you just by virtue of being the same species. And so this becomes a very useful tool to be able to use because you can start to notice that people just generally kind of work the same way, and it becomes easier to be empathetic if you remain open-minded in that way and realize that you're not as different from people as you might think yourself to be. Yeah, so in a sense, you have to be brave enough to be radically empathetic to people. You have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of people you would think are uh, if you were to call them evil, let's say, people that you think are quite despicable, you should be able to sort of open your mind enough to be able to put yourself in that person's shoes in order to understand what's going on with them. Because a resistance to other people shows a resistance within yourself, and that resistance obscures a lot of wisdom from you. Now, this isn't to say that you're going to give them a pass on negative behavior. If somebody's doing negative behavior, of course, renounce the behavior, but you have to understand that the human condition is quite frail in and of itself. And so, uh, in a sense, it becomes, once you look at that, easier to become empathetic to people that you may not normally be empathetic toward. Yeah, so the social shadow, so basically, society's shadow, just like the individual shadow, you can look toward particular things and you can start to develop sort of an affinity for those things, sort of valuing those things more. So, one example of something that used to be part of our social shadow that we're now becoming more aware of is, let's say, the LGBT community. Let's say back in the 90s, there was a lot more stigma toward that, and now we're becoming aware of the fact that that stigma wasn't really based in very much. I mean, there's not really a particular negative thing if you're like, there's no actual effect there that's going to happen if you're not already gay. So there's no reason to demonize people for being gay. And so now we're pretty aware of that. But before, we as a society were just unconscious, and there was like this default judgment there as in, oh, that's strange and therefore it's bad. But once we actually dig into that, we see that, oh, there's no real problem that comes from being gay. And so most people now are on the side of accepting homosexuality and accepting homosexuals as people. But before, there was this idea that, oh, that's perverted and wrong and nasty, and we didn't really dig into that belief as much. So that's an example of one element of our collective shadow. So there are a lot of different elements like this, and you'll notice that the way societies work, they kind of have sort of a predictable arc to them. You can sort of see where society's going, and so once you start to become attuned to this, it becomes a lot easier to become aware of social patterns as well as patterns within yourself. But anyway, that's all I have for you for now. Stay tuned for my shadow work video, and that should be up in just an hour or two if I if I can get it up without much more technical difficulty. Anyway, have a good night.